I pulled into my parents' driveway on Christmas Eve expecting the usual family dinner with forced smiles and awkward small talk. Instead, I walked into what felt like a courtroom. There, sitting at the head of our dining room table like some ghost from the past, was my grandfather Thomas, supposedly dead for 3 years. His weathered hand slammed against the mahogany surface with such force that the china rattled. "Why is a stranger controlling the multi-million-dollar company I left you?" he demanded, his steel gray eyes boring into mine. I froze completely, my mouth hanging open like a broken gate. "What are you talking about? I don't even have a dollar to my name." The Christmas dinner I'd been dreading suddenly became the most important moment of my life. My name is Alan, and I thought I knew everything about my family until that moment when the impossible walked through our front door. The silence that followed my grandfather's accusation felt heavier than a concrete block. My parents, David and Patricia, sat frozen like deer, caught in headlights, their faces draining of color faster than water down a sink. My older brother Jake dropped his fork, and it clattered against his plate like a gunshot in the quiet room. The expensive suit he wore, something I could never afford on my construction worker's salary, suddenly seemed out of place in our modest suburban home. Thomas studied each face around the table with the calculating gaze of a man who'd built a construction empire from nothing. His presence filled the room despite being in his 70s, and I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that he was sitting there breathing when I'd attended his funeral 3 years ago. The funeral where I'd thrown dirt on his casket and cried for the only family member who'd ever believed in me. "Alan," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded construction crews for 40 years. "When I supposedly died, you were the sole beneficiary of Riverside Construction Company. $12 million in assets, equipment, and contracts. So tell me why Jake here is driving a new Mercedes while you're wearing work boots with holes in them." My head spun like I'd been hit with a 2x4. Riverside Construction Company had been my grandfather's pride and joy, built from a single pickup truck into one of the most successful building contractors in 3 counties. But I'd never heard anything about inheriting it. After his death, my parents told me there was no will, no inheritance, nothing but debts and legal complications. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away seconds that felt like hours. Christmas lights twinkled mockingly from the mantelpiece, casting strange shadows across faces that suddenly looked like strangers. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles that should have been comforting now felt suffocating. Jake finally found his voice, but it came out as a croak. "Grandpa, you're supposed to be—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Dead," Thomas supplied with a bitter laugh. "That was the general idea, wasn't it?" Before anyone could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the winter night. Car doors slammed outside, and heavy footsteps pounded up our front porch steps. My father jumped up so quickly, his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor. The doorbell rang, once followed immediately by authoritative knocking that could only mean one thing. Through the frosted glass of our front door, I could see the unmistakable silhouettes of police officers, their badges glinting under the porch light. My mother, Patricia, clutched her pearls, real ones. I now realized not the costume jewelry she'd claimed they were when I asked why she could afford them, while I struggled to pay rent on my studio apartment. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "This can't be happening." Thomas stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and confident. "Actually, Patricia, this is exactly what's supposed to happen." The knocking grew more insistent, and a voice called out, "Police, open the door, please." Everything I thought I knew about my family was about to crumble like a house built on sand. As I moved toward the front door on unsteady legs, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. 28 years old, wearing the same flannel shirt I'd owned for 5 years, looking every bit the struggling construction worker I'd become while apparently my family lived off money that should have been mine. The Christmas dinner that was supposed to bring us together was about to tear us apart in ways I never could have imagined. I opened the front door to find two uniformed officers and a detective with sharp eyes and graying temples. The older of the three, a woman with sergeant stripes, spoke first. "We received an anonymous tip about ongoing fraud at this address. May we come in?" My grandfather's voice carried from the dining room. "Officers, please join us. I'm the one who called you." The detective, who introduced herself as Sarah Chen, stepped into our home with the confidence of someone who'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable. Her dark hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and her brown eyes missed nothing as they swept across our Christmas scene. "Mr. Thomas Brennan," she said, recognizing my grandfather immediately. "It's good to see you alive and well." The word "alive" hit the room like a physical blow. My mother gasped and grabbed the doorframe for support. My father's face went from pale to gray, and Jake looked like he might throw up all over his expensive shirt. Thomas gestured for everyone to sit back down while the officers remained standing. "Detective Chen and I have been working together for the past 8 months, he explained calmly. "You see, Alan faking my own death was the only way to expose what your family was planning to do to both of us." My legs gave out, and I collapsed into the nearest chair. 8 months. He'd been alive for 8 months while I grieved him, visited his grave, and struggled to understand why life felt so impossibly difficult without his guidance. "I don't understand any of this," I managed to say. "You're supposed to be dead. I was at your funeral. I watched them lower your casket into the ground." Detective Chen pulled out a thick folder and set it on our dining room table next to my mother's carefully arranged poinsettias. "What you witnessed was an elaborate fraud orchestrated by your parents and brother. The casket contained sandbags weighing approximately 180 pounds to match your grandfather's weight." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes never leaving my face. 3 years ago, I discovered something that broke my heart. My own son and daughter-in-law had forged my will, planning to steal your inheritance and eventually eliminate both of us. The words hit me like falling concrete. My father, my own father, had been planning to kill me. "The original will left everything to you, Alan," Thomas continued. "Riverside Construction Company, the equipment yard, all contracts and assets. $12 million total. But somehow a new will appeared after my supposed death, leaving everything to Jake." Jake finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "This is insane. Grandpa's been dead for 3 years. This is some kind of con game." Detective Chen opened her folder and pulled out a death certificate. "This is the falsified document your family filed with the state. Notice the signature of Dr. Marcus Williams, who we arrested this morning for falsifying medical records. He's already confessed to everything in exchange for a reduced sentence." My mother started crying, but they weren't tears of joy at seeing her supposedly dead father-in-law alive. They were tears of fear of someone whose carefully constructed lies were collapsing around her. "Patricia," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm, "I know about the sedatives. I know how you kept me drugged for 3 weeks before the fake funeral, making me appear to be dying of natural causes. I know about the bribes to Dr. Williams and the funeral director. I know everything." The room felt like it was spinning. My entire family, everyone except my grandfather, had conspired to steal from me. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks at various construction jobs just to afford groceries, my brother had been living off money that rightfully belonged to me. Detective Chen pulled out more documents. "For the past 3 years, your brother has been selling off company assets. Heavy machinery worth hundreds of thousands of dollars sold to competitors at below-market prices. Longtime employees have been fired and replaced with cheaper labor. The company your grandfather built over 40 years has been systematically destroyed. I thought about all the times I'd asked my family for help when I couldn't make rent or afford car repairs, how they'd told me times were tough, money was tight. Maybe I should look for better work. Meanwhile, Jake had been driving luxury cars and wearing designer clothes paid for with my inheritance. The most heartbreaking part, Thomas said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, was watching you struggle while they lived in luxury. You're a good man, Alan. You work hard, you're honest, and you deserved so much better than what they gave you. Detective Chen nodded toward her officers. David Brennan, Patricia Brennan, Jake Brennan. You're under arrest for fraud conspiracy, falsifying death records, and conspiracy to commit murder. The words conspiracy to commit murder echoed in my head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. My own family hadn't just stolen from me, they'd planned to kill me. As the handcuffs clicked into place around my father's wrists, he finally looked at me. There was no remorse in his eyes, only anger at being caught. You always were his favorite, he spat. Everything handed to you on a silver platter. I stared at him in disbelief. A silver platter. I'd been living in poverty while they spent my money. The delusion was staggering. Thomas stood up and walked over to me as the officers led my family away. I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way, son. But I couldn't let them destroy you the way they destroyed everything else I worked for. Through the front window, I watched my parents and brother being placed in separate police cars, their Christmas dinner ending in the back seats of squad cars. The surreal nature of it all made me feel like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. Detective Chen handed me her business card. There's a lot more to discuss, Alan. Your grandfather has been gathering evidence for months. Tomorrow we'll need you to come to the station to hear the full scope of what they did. As the police cars drove away, taking my family into the night, I sat alone, with the grandfather I'd thought was dead, trying to process the fact that my entire life had been built on lies. The Christmas tree lights continued twinkling cheerfully, oblivious to the fact that everything I'd believed about my family had just been shattered beyond repair. The next morning, I met Detective Chen and my grandfather at the police station downtown. The building smelled like coffee and disinfectant, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. I hadn't slept a minute the night before, my mind racing with questions that seemed to multiply faster than I could process them. Detective Chen led us into a conference room where the table was covered with boxes of documents, photographs, and what looked like enough evidence to fill a small library. The scope of it overwhelmed me before anyone said a word. Alan. Thomas began settling into a chair across from me. What I'm about to show you will be difficult to hear, but you need to understand exactly how deep this conspiracy went. Detective Chen opened the first box and pulled out a stack of medical records. Let's start with your grandfather's supposed illness. For 6 months before his fake death, your family was slowly poisoning him with sedatives, creating the appearance of declining health. She showed me prescription bottles with my mother's name on them. Patricia was obtaining powerful sleep medications by claiming she had severe insomnia. She was crushing these pills and putting them in your grandfather's food. The dosage was carefully calculated to make him appear increasingly frail and confused without killing him. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. My mother, who'd raised me, who'd kissed my scraped knees and made my favorite birthday cakes, had been slowly drugging my grandfather to steal from both of us. Thomas pulled out a folder marked Financial Records. While they were making me appear to be losing my mind, Jake was already positioning himself to take over the company. He convinced several longtime clients that I was developing dementia and that he should handle their accounts. The photographs Detective Chen showed me next made my stomach turn. Pictures of expensive machinery being loaded onto trucks sold to competitors at a fraction of their value. Equipment worth $300,000 sold for $30,000. Assets that represented decades of my grandfather's hard work disappearing into my brother's bank accounts. 23 loyal employees were fired during the first year after the fake funeral. Thomas explained, his voice heavy with regret. Men who'd worked for me for 15-20 years. Frank Rodriguez, my foreman, had been with the company since he was 18. Helen Morrison, my accountant, had managed our books for 12 years, all of them thrown out so Jake could bring in cheaper workers and pocket the difference. I thought about Frank Rodriguez, a man I'd known since childhood. He'd taught me how to use power tools and had always said I had natural talent for construction work. After my grandfather's supposed death, I'd lost touch with all his employees, assuming the company had simply closed down due to debt. Detective Chen opened another box, this one filled with bank records. Your education fund was the first thing they stole. $40,000 set aside for your college tuition, gone within 2 months of the fake funeral. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always wondered why my grandfather, who'd promised to help pay for my education, had apparently left nothing for that purpose. I'd ended up taking out massive student loans that I was still paying off working construction jobs instead of finishing my engineering degree. But the most damaging theft, Thomas continued, was taking away your future. Riverside Construction Company was supposed to be yours. You have real talent, Alan. You understand the business, you're good with people, and you have the work ethic to make it thrive. Instead, I'd spent 3 years believing I was just another construction worker with no prospects, no family business to inherit, no security for my future. Jake had stolen not just money, but my sense of purpose and belonging. Detective Chen pulled out a recording device. Your grandfather has been wearing a wire for the past 4 months. We have your family on tape discussing their plans in detail. She pressed play, and my father's voice filled the room. The kid's getting suspicious about why he never got any inheritance. Maybe it's time for that accident we discussed. My mother's response chilled my blood. Make it look like a construction site accident. Those happen all the time. Jake's voice joined the conversation. I've already picked out the site. That new apartment complex on 5th Street, faulty scaffolding, 20-foot fall. Quick and clean. I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. They weren't just talking about stealing money, they were planning my murder with the casual tone of people discussing weekend plans. Thomas reached across and took my hand. I'm sorry you had to hear that, son, but you needed to understand how far they were willing to go. Detective Chen stopped the recording. We have hours of conversations like this. They also discussed how to handle your grandfather if he ever surfaced planning to claim he was an imposter, suffering from dementia. The evidence kept piling up like debris from a demolished building. Forged signatures on legal documents, bribes paid to Dr. Williams to falsify medical records payments to the funeral director to participate in the fake burial. Even the cemetery plot had been part of the scam. They'd buried an empty casket while my grandfather recovered in a safe house gathering evidence. Emma Walsh, your ex-fiancée. Detective Chen continued pulling out another folder. Did you ever wonder why she suddenly broke up with you 2 years ago? The mention of Emma's name brought back all the pain of losing the woman I'd planned to marry. She said I was irresponsible with money, that I had no future prospects. Thomas's jaw tightened with anger. Jake approached Emma several months before she broke up with you. He convinced her that you were secretly gambling away your inheritance, that you'd hidden debts and addiction problems. The room felt like it was tilting. Emma, the woman I'd loved more than life itself, had been manipulated by my own brother. He showed her fake bank statements and credit reports suggesting you owed thousands of dollars to loan sharks, Detective Chen added. She broke up with you because she was genuinely afraid for her safety. Everything made sense now. Emma's sudden coldness, her refusal to explain why she was leaving, her insistence that I needed to get my life together before we could have a future. She hadn't been cruel. She'd been protecting herself from dangers that didn't exist. Meanwhile, Thomas said, his voice grim. Jake started dating Emma himself 6 months after your breakup. Paid for expensive dinners, vacations, jewelry, all with money stolen from your inheritance. The betrayal kept expanding like cracks in concrete, reaching into every corner of my life. My family hadn't just stolen my money and planned my murder, they'd destroyed my relationship and stolen the woman I loved. Detective Chen closed the boxes of evidence. Your grandfather spent 8 months gathering all of this. He couldn't surface earlier because he needed ironclad proof that would hold up in court. Thomas stood up slowly, looking every one of his 74 years. I couldn't save your relationship with Emma, and I couldn't give you back those 3 years of struggling. But I can give you justice, and I can give you your birthright. As we left the police station, I felt like I was carrying the weight of my family's betrayal on my shoulders. But underneath the pain and anger, something else was growing, a determination to reclaim everything they'd stolen and to make sure their victims got the justice they deserved. The war for my future was just beginning, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't fighting it alone. 3 days later, I found myself back at the police station for what Detective Chen called the complete disclosure meeting. She'd warned me that there were additional details about my family's conspiracy that would be difficult to process, but I thought I'd already heard the worst of it. I was catastrophically wrong. Thomas was already in the conference room when I arrived, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His usually straight shoulders were slumped, and his eyes carried a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Before we begin," Detective Chen said, arranging new files on the table, "I need you to understand that what we're about to discuss represents the complete scope of your family's plans. Some of this information came from Dr. Williams after he agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation." She opened a medical file that made my blood run cold. "The sedatives they were giving your grandfather weren't just to make him appear sick. In higher doses, they would have killed him. Your family was slowly increasing the dosage over time, planning to murder him after the will was changed, but before he could discover their fraud." Thomas nodded grimly. "Patricia was my nurse during those final weeks. Every meal, every drink, every medication, all of it contaminated with drugs that were designed to eventually stop my heart. The image of my mother carefully poisoning my grandfather while pretending to care for him twisted my stomach into knots. How could someone look into the eyes of a man they were slowly killing and maintain a facade of love and concern?" Detective Chen pulled out another set of documents. "Dr. Williams has provided us with detailed records of your family's plans for you, Alan. The construction site accident was just one option they considered." She spread out what looked like a timeline written in my father's handwriting. Different dates, different methods, different locations for my planned murder, car accidents, workplace injuries, even poisoning similar to what they'd planned for my grandfather. "They were going to wait until the company assets were completely liquidated," she explained. "Once they'd converted everything to cash and moved it to offshore accounts, you would have had an unfortunate accident." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "They discussed it like they were planning a vacation. Your own father suggested making it look like you'd fallen from scaffolding because the insurance payout would provide additional funds. The casual nature of their murder planning horrified me more than the plans themselves. These weren't desperate people acting in a moment of panic. They were methodically calculating the best way to eliminate the only person standing between them and complete control of stolen wealth." Detective Chen opened another file. "There's something else about Emma that you need to know. Jake didn't just manipulate her, he orchestrated her entire relationship with someone else." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "After Emma broke up with you, Jake introduced her to a man named Marcus Thompson. Told her Marcus was a successful investment advisor who could help her secure her financial future. What he didn't tell her was that Marcus was actually Jake's college friend, and the whole thing was an elaborate setup." The conference room felt like it was closing in around me. "A setup for what?" Thomas answered, his voice heavy with disgust. "To get Emma pregnant. Jake wanted to make sure you could never win her back, even if you discovered the truth about your inheritance. He figured a woman with a child would never return to someone she'd been convinced was financially unstable. The cruelty of it staggered me. Jake hadn't just stolen my money and planned my murder, he'd engineered the destruction of my relationship and tried to ensure I'd spend the rest of my life alone." Detective Chen pulled out surveillance photos. "Emma dated Marcus for 18 months. During that time, Jake was feeding Marcus information about her preferences, her schedule, even her emotional vulnerabilities. Marcus was essentially paid to become the perfect boyfriend. I stared at photos of Emma with a man I didn't recognize looking happy, in ways I hadn't seen her look with me during our final months together. The manipulation was so comprehensive that even her subsequent happiness had been manufactured by my brother. The good news, Thomas said quietly, is that Emma never got pregnant, and she broke up with Marcus 6 months ago when she discovered he was lying about his job and his background. Detective Chen nodded. She filed a complaint with us about Marcus's deceptive behavior. When we showed her the evidence about Jake's involvement, she was devastated. She asked me to tell you that she's sorry and that she wants to speak with you when you're ready. The information about Emma should have made me happy, but instead, it just highlighted the scope of my family's manipulation. They'd stolen 3 years of my life, destroyed my relationship, planned my murder, and tried to ensure I'd never have a chance at happiness. There's one more thing, Detective Chen said, her voice becoming even more serious. We found evidence that you weren't their only target. Jake was systematically identifying other potential inheritance situations to replicate this scam. She showed me a notebook in Jake's handwriting filled with names of elderly people in our community and details about their family situations and assets. He was planning to approach other families with elderly relatives, offering to help them manage inheritances in exchange for significant fees. Essentially, he wanted to build a business around inheritance fraud. Thomas shook his head in disgust. He was going to use the money stolen from you to fund a criminal enterprise that would have destroyed dozens of families. The scope of my family's greed and cruelty seemed endless. They weren't just thieves, they were planning to become professional predators, targeting vulnerable families throughout our community. Detective Chen gathered the files. Tomorrow, your parents and brother will be formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, inheritance fraud, and racketeering. The evidence we've gathered ensures they'll spend decades in prison. As we left the police station, Thomas put his arm around my shoulders. I know this is overwhelming, son, but I want you to remember that their evil doesn't define you. You're nothing like them. Walking to our cars, I felt like I was emerging from a nightmare that had lasted 3 years. My family's betrayal was complete. They'd stolen my money, planned my murder, destroyed my relationship, and plotted to hurt other innocent families. But for the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt something besides pain and anger. I felt a burning determination to make sure they paid for every life they'd damaged and every family they'd planned to destroy. The depth of their betrayal would have destroyed some people. Instead, it was about to transform me into someone strong enough to fight back and win. The following week brought revelations that shifted everything I thought I knew about the past 3 years. Detective Chen called me to the station again, but this time the conference room was filled with people I recognized, and their presence changed the entire dynamic of my situation. Frank Rodriguez, my grandfather's former foreman, stood up as soon as I entered the room. At 55, he was still built like the construction worker he'd been his entire adult life, with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin that spoke of decades spent building other people's dreams. "Alan," he said, gripping my hand firmly, "I've been waiting 3 years to have this conversation." Beside him sat Helen Morrison, the accountant, who'd managed Riverside Construction's books since I was in high school. Her gray hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd always worn, and her sharp blue eyes held the same intelligence that had made her my grandfather's most trusted business advisor. Detective Chen gestured for everyone to sit. "Frank and Helen have been working with your grandfather since the beginning. They're the reason we have such comprehensive evidence against your family." Thomas smiled for the first time since I'd seen him at Christmas dinner. When Jake fired them, they knew something was wrong. Helen had copies of all the real financial records, and Frank had documented every piece of equipment that was sold illegally. Frank pulled out a thick binder. I've been photographing and recording everything for 3 years. Every time Jake sold equipment below market value, every time he fired long-time employees, every conversation I overheard about the company's future, all of it documented. Helen opened her laptop and turned it toward me. I maintained parallel books showing the company's actual value versus what Jake was reporting. Riverside Construction should be worth $15 million. Now not the $5 million Jake claimed when he applied for business loans using fraudulent information. The difference was staggering. Not only had Jake stolen my inheritance, but he'd also managed to increase its value while systematically destroying the company's reputation and workforce. The equipment Jake sold, Frank continued flipping through photographs. I tracked down every piece. Most of it went to Bradley Construction, owned by Jake's college roommate. They paid 30 cents on the dollar and agreed to hire Jake as a consultant once he'd liquidated everything. Detective Chen nodded. We've arrested Bradley's owner as well. He knew he was buying stolen equipment and was planning to give Jake a position in his company once Riverside was completely destroyed. Thomas leaned forward. Frank, tell Alan about the employees. Frank's expression grew serious. 23 people lost their jobs when Jake took over. Good people with families. Mortgages, kids in college. But here's the thing, we all stayed in touch. We've been meeting monthly for 3 years, trying to figure out how to prove something was wrong. Helen clicked through screens on her laptop. We have documentation of every illegal firing, every safety violation Jake created by hiring unqualified workers, every contract he lost because of incompetent management. The evidence is overwhelming. A woman I didn't recognize entered the room and introduced herself as Rebecca Martinez, the attorney my grandfather had hired. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the confident bearing of someone who'd built her career on fighting for people who'd been wronged. Alan, she said, setting a briefcase on the table, your grandfather has been paying me to prepare a comprehensive legal strategy. We're not just seeking criminal prosecution, we're going after complete financial recovery and restoration of your company. The phrase, your company, hit me like lightning. For 3 years, I'd thought of myself as just another construction worker with no prospects. Now I was being told that I owned a multi-million-dollar business with loyal employees ready to return. Rebecca opened her briefcase and pulled out legal documents. We've identified every asset Jake sold illegally, and we have grounds to reclaim all of it. The buyers will have to return the equipment or face prosecution as accessories to theft. Frank grinned for the first time since I'd entered the room. We've also been keeping track of all the employees Jake fired. Every single one of them wants to come back. These people didn't just lose jobs, they lost family. Helen turned her laptop screen toward me again, showing a spreadsheet with names, contact information, and employment histories. I've maintained records on everyone. We can have the core team back to work within a week of regaining control of the company. The loyalty of these people overwhelmed me. They'd been unemployed or underemployed for 3 years, but they'd maintained faith that somehow justice would prevail, and they'd be able to return to the company they'd helped build. Thomas reached across the table and squeezed my shoulder. This is what real family looks like, son. People who stand by you even when everything seems hopeless. Detective Chen pulled out another folder. There's something else. Dr. Williams, in exchange for cooperation, has provided us with evidence about other families Jake was targeting. We've prevented at least 4 other inheritance fraud schemes that were in the planning stages. Rebecca nodded approvingly. Those families will likely file civil lawsuits against your family as well. The financial damage to your parents and brother will be catastrophic. Frank leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. Jake thought he was so smart firing all of us old-timers and bringing in cheap labor, but he didn't realize we'd been documenting everything from day one. Helen closed her laptop. We knew Thomas was too smart and too careful to leave his company to Jake without safeguards. When Jake started making obviously bad decisions, we figured something was seriously wrong. The meeting continued for another 2 hours with each person contributing pieces of evidence that painted a picture of my family's complete incompetence as criminals. They'd been so focused on the immediate theft that they'd ignored the long-term consequences of their actions. As we prepared to leave, Rebecca handed me a business card. Tomorrow we file for emergency restoration of your legal ownership of Riverside Construction. By next week, you should be the rightful president of your own company. Frank stood up and extended his hand again. Alan, I've been waiting 3 years to say this. Welcome back, boss. The word boss echoed in my head as I drove home that night. 3 days ago, I'd been a struggling construction worker with no family and no prospects. Now I was about to become the president of a multi-million-dollar company with loyal employees ready to rebuild everything my family had tried to destroy. For the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt something that had been missing from my life for 3 years, hope for the future. Within 48 hours of our strategy meeting, the legal counterattack began with the precision of a well-planned construction project. Rebecca Martinez had assembled a team of attorneys that moved through the court system like professionals who'd been preparing for this battle their entire careers. I stood outside the courthouse on a cold January morning, watching my family being led inside for their arraignment. They were no longer the confident manipulators who'd controlled my life for 3 years. David walked with hunched shoulders, his expensive suit wrinkled from spending several nights in jail. Patricia's carefully maintained appearance had crumbled. Her gray roots were showing, and her makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion of someone whose lies had finally caught up with her. But it was Jake who looked the most broken. The brother who'd stolen my inheritance, planned my murder, and destroyed my relationship, now shuffled along in handcuffs, his designer clothes replaced with an orange jumpsuit that made him look like what he'd always been underneath the facade, a common criminal. Rebecca met me at the courthouse steps. The judge has agreed to an emergency hearing for asset recovery. We should have preliminary ownership transfer within hours. Inside the courtroom, I watched my family face the consequences of their choices. The prosecutor laid out charges that sounded like something from a crime drama conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, inheritance, fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to falsify death records. Judge Margaret Thornton, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and piercing eyes, listened to the evidence with the expression of someone who'd seen every variety of human greed, but was still disgusted by the details. When the prosecutor finished presenting the case, Judge Thornton addressed my family directly. In 40 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a comprehensive betrayal of family bonds and basic human decency. She set bail at $2 million each, money they no longer had access to since all their assets had been frozen. They would remain in jail until their trial, which Rebecca estimated would take place within 6 months. After the hearing, I drove directly to the offices of Riverside Construction Company, a building I hadn't visited since my grandfather's funeral. The receptionist, a woman Jake had hired to replace Helen's assistant, looked confused when I introduced myself as the new owner. "I'm sorry," she said politely, "but Mr. Jake Brennan is the owner of this company." Rebecca handed her legal documents. "Not anymore. These are court orders transferring ownership to Alan Brennan, effective immediately." Within an hour, the building began filling with familiar faces I hadn't seen in 3 years. Frank Rodriguez arrived first, carrying a toolbox, like he'd never stopped working there. Helen Morrison came next, wheeling a cart full of the financial records she'd maintained independently since being fired. One by one, the 23 employees Jake had terminated began arriving. Some had found other jobs and had to give notice, but others had been unemployed or underemployed for years, waiting for exactly this opportunity. Frank gathered everyone in the main conference room. "People were about to rebuild this company from scratch. It's going to take hard work, long hours, and complete dedication. Anyone who's not ready for that challenge can leave now with no hard feelings." Nobody left. If anything, people leaned forward with the eagerness of soldiers preparing for a battle they'd been waiting years to fight. Helen opened her laptop and connected it to the conference room's projection system. "Let me show you what we're working with." The financial presentation she'd prepared was more comprehensive than anything I'd seen from legitimate business consultants. She'd tracked every asset, every contract, every piece of equipment, and every potential recovery opportunity. Current legitimate assets, $8.7 million, she announced. Illegally sold equipment, we can reclaim $4.2 million. Contracts Jake lost through incompetence, that we can renegotiate, estimated $3.1 million annual revenue. Frank stood up. The equipment buyback is already in progress. Bradley Construction has agreed to return everything they purchased illegally rather than face prosecution. We'll have our full fleet operational within 2 weeks. I looked around the room at faces that showed determination, loyalty, and a hunger for justice that matched my own. These people hadn't just lost jobs, they'd lost their professional family, their sense of purpose, their financial security. "There's something else," Rebecca announced from the back of the room. "We've been contacted by Emma Walsh. She wants to meet with Alan to discuss what happened and to apologize for her role in the situation." The mention of Emma's name sent electricity through my chest. For 3 years, I'd believed she'd left me because I wasn't good enough, wasn't successful enough, wasn't worthy of her love. Now I knew she'd been manipulated by people who wanted to destroy my life. "She's also provided evidence about Marcus Thompson, the man Jake set her up with," Rebecca continued. "Marcus has been arrested for fraud in connection with several other romantic scams. Emma's testimony will help prosecutors build additional cases against Jake." Frank clapped his hands together. "All right, people, let's get to work. Helen, I need you to audit everything Jake touched. Everyone else, we're rebuilding this company the way Thomas originally designed it, with integrity, quality work, and respect for our employees." As the room emptied and people headed to their old desks and workstations, I felt a transformation happening inside me. For 3 years, I'd been a victim of my family's cruelty. But surrounded by people who'd stood by me, even when I didn't know they existed, I was becoming something entirely different. I was becoming the leader my grandfather had always believed I could be. Rebecca approached me as I stood looking out at the equipment yard that was about to be restored to its former efficiency. "There's one more thing, Alan. Dr. Williams has provided evidence that your family was planning to expand their operation to other states. We're coordinating with federal investigators to ensure they face the maximum possible consequences." The scope of justice was expanding beyond just recovering what they'd stolen from me. My family's downfall was going to prevent them from destroying other families, other businesses, other lives. That evening, I called my grandfather from the office that was now officially mine. "Thomas, I want you to know that Riverside Construction Company is going to be better than it ever was. We're going to honor everything you built while making it stronger." His voice came through the phone filled with pride and satisfaction. "I always knew you had it in you, son. Your parents and brother never understood that stealing someone else's work doesn't make you successful. It just makes you a thief." As I hung up the phone and looked around the office where my grandfather had built an empire from nothing, I understood that my family's betrayal had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the chance to prove that I was nothing like them. The war was far from over, but for the first time in 3 years, I was fighting from a position of strength. 6 months later, I sat in the same courtroom where my family had been arraigned, but this time I was there to witness the final chapter of their criminal enterprise. The trial had been a media sensation locally, with newspapers calling it the most shocking family betrayal case in county history. Federal prosecutors had taken over the case after discovering the interstate nature of my family's planned expansion. Agent Sarah Martinez, Detective Chen's federal counterpart, had spent months unraveling a conspiracy that reached far beyond what any of us had initially imagined. David, Patricia, and Jake sat at the defendant's table looking like shadows of their former selves. 6 months in jail awaiting trial had stripped away every pretense of respectability they'd maintained while spending my stolen inheritance. The prosecutor assistant district attorney Michael Romano addressed the jury for his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard over the past 3 weeks isn't just a story about greed. It's about the systematic destruction of everything decent about family relationships. He gestured toward boxes of evidence that filled half the courtroom. The defendants didn't just steal money. They poisoned an elderly man, faked his death, planned to murder his grandson, and destroyed a business that employed dozens of hardworking families. Judge Thornton had allowed victim impact statements, and I'd spent weeks preparing mine. When my turn came, I stood and faced the jury, but my words were directed at my family. For 3 years, I believed I was worthless. I began. I believed my own grandfather hadn't loved me enough to leave me anything. I believed the woman I wanted to marry had left me because I was a failure. I believed I had no future, no prospects, no value as a human being. Patricia started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity from someone who couldn't understand why her crimes had consequences. But the worst part, I continued, wasn't what they stole from me. It was what they stole from 23 loyal employees who lost their jobs, from elderly people in our community who they were planning to target next, from Emma, who was manipulated into believing lies about someone she loved. The jury listened with rapt attention as I described the ripple effects of my family's cruelty, how Frank Rodriguez had struggled to support his disabled wife without steady employment, how Helen Morrison had been forced to work part-time retail jobs despite having decades of accounting experience, how former employees had lost their homes, their savings, their sense of dignity. Dr. Marcus Williams had already been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in falsifying medical records. The funeral director who'd participated in the fake burial received 3 years. Even Marcus Thompson, Jake's accomplice in manipulating Emma, was serving 18 months for fraud. When the verdicts were read 3 days later, the sentences reflected the scope of their crimes. David received 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and racketeering. Patricia got 22 years for the same charges. Jake is the mastermind who'd orchestrated the day-to-day operations, received 30 years in federal prison. Judge Thornton's final words to them were measured, but devastating. You have betrayed every principle of family loyalty, business ethics, and basic human decency. The sentences I'm imposing reflect not just the crimes you committed, but the lives you destroyed, and the additional crimes you plan to commit. As my family was led away in shackles, I felt something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction or revenge, but a profound sense of closure. The people who'd stolen 3 years of my life would spend decades paying for their choices. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca Martinez handed me the final legal documents. All assets have been recovered. Riverside Construction Company is now worth $18.4 million more than it was worth when your grandfather supposedly died. Frank Rodriguez, who'd been promoted to vice president of operations, shook my hand firmly. Boss, we've got more contract offers than we can handle. Word's gotten out about what we've been through, and people want to do business with a company that stands for something. Helen Morrison, now chief financial officer, opened her tablet to show me our latest quarterly reports. We've hired 37 new employees, including 15 people who were laid off from other construction companies during the recession. We're not just rebuilding, we're expanding. The personal restoration was even more meaningful than the financial recovery. Emma had asked to meet with me the week before the trial, and our conversation had been both heartbreaking and healing. I'm so sorry, Alan, she'd said, tears streaming down her face. I should have trusted what I knew about you instead of believing what Jake told me. We'd talked for 3 hours, processing the manipulation and betrayal we'd both experienced. While we couldn't rebuild our romantic relationship, too much had happened. Too much time had passed. We'd found peace and friendship where there had been pain and confusion. Thomas, now officially retired and serving as chairman emeritus of Riverside Construction, joined us outside the courthouse. At 75, he looked healthier and happier than he had since before his fake death. Alan, he said, putting his arm around my shoulders, your parents and brother thought they could steal your future. Instead, they gave you something more valuable than money. They taught you who your real family is. He gestured toward Frank Helen and the dozen other Riverside employees who'd come to witness the verdicts. These people stood by you when they had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That's worth more than any inheritance. Agent Martinez approached our group with a final update. The investigation into Jake's planned expansion has prevented an estimated 47 inheritance fraud schemes in 12 states. Your family's downfall has protected millions of dollars in legitimate inheritances. As we drove back to the Riverside construction offices, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. A year ago, I'd been a struggling construction worker with no family, no prospects, and no hope. Now I was the president of a thriving company, surrounded by people who'd proven their loyalty through the darkest possible circumstances. The building that housed Riverside Construction had been renovated and expanded. Our equipment yard was filled with new machinery. Our employee parking lot was full of cars belonging to people who came to work each day knowing they were valued and respected. That evening, I stood in my grandfather's old office now, my office looking at framed photographs of construction projects spanning 4 decades, pictures of bridges, schools, hospitals, and homes that Riverside Construction had built throughout the region. Frank knocked on my door and entered with a bottle of champagne. "Boss, I wanted to toast the end of the trial and the beginning of whatever comes next." As we raised our glasses, he continued, "You know, when your grandfather first hired me 28 years ago, he told me that the construction business isn't really about buildings. It's about creating things that last longer than the people who build them." I looked around at the office that represented not just a business, but a legacy of integrity, hard work, and loyalty that had survived my family's attempt to destroy it. "Here's to building things that last," I said, and we drank to a future that finally belonged to the people who'd earned it through dedication rather than theft. The nightmare was over. The rebuilding was complete. And justice delayed but not denied had finally been served. 2 years after that Christmas dinner, that changed everything. I stood on the balcony of Riverside Construction Company's new headquarters, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The building below me buzzed with the activity of 85 employees who came to work each day knowing they were part of something meaningful. Thomas joined me on the balcony, moving more slowly than he had at 75, but still carrying himself with the dignity of a man who'd built an empire through honest work. "You know, Alan," he said, leaning against the railing, "I always imagined this moment when you'd be standing here as the leader this company deserves." The transformation had been beyond anything I could have envisioned during those dark years when I believed I was worthless. Riverside Construction Company was now the largest contractor in 3 counties, with projects ranging from affordable housing developments to the new children's hospital that would open next spring. Frank Rodriguez approached from behind us, carrying a tablet with the day's schedule. "Boss, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Morrison Family Recreation Center is at 10, and the interview with Business Weekly is at 2. The Morrison Family Recreation Center had been my idea, a community facility funded by Riverside Construction to honor Helen Morrison and provide opportunities for local families. It represented something my grandfather had always believed, that successful businesses had obligations to strengthen their communities. Helen Morrison herself had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer, overseeing not just our finances, but our expansion into 3 new markets. The woman Jake had fired for being too expensive had become one of the most respected business leaders in the region. "There's something else," Frank continued with a grin. "Jennifer Walsh called to confirm dinner tonight. She said to remind you that her parents are excited to meet the famous Alan Brennan." Jennifer Walsh was a social worker who specialized in helping families affected by financial fraud. We'd met at a conference where I'd been speaking about inheritance protection, and our relationship had grown slowly and naturally over the past year. Unlike my relationship with Emma, which had been built on false assumptions and manipulation, my connection with Jennifer was founded on shared values and genuine understanding. The foundation I'd established, the Thomas Brennan Foundation for Inheritance Protection, had become a national model for preventing the kind of fraud my family had attempted. We'd helped more than 200 families protect their legacies and had worked with law enforcement agencies in 30 states to identify and prevent similar schemes. Thomas pulled out a letter from his jacket pocket. "This came yesterday. I thought you'd want to see it." The envelope bore the letterhead of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Inside was a form letter informing us that Jake had applied for early parole consideration and been denied. He would serve his full 30-year sentence without possibility of parole review for another 15 years. "Good," I said simply. The anger that had once consumed me when thinking about my family had long since transformed into indifference. They were part of my past, not my future. Detective Chen, now a close family friend, had kept us informed about my parents' situation as well. David had suffered a heart attack in prison the previous year and was in declining health. Patricia had been transferred to a minimum security facility after demonstrating good behavior, but she would still serve at least 18 more years. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were now completely dependent on the state for their basic needs, food, shelter, medical care, while I lived in abundance, created through honest work and genuine relationships. Emma had moved to Portland the year before, starting fresh with a new career and a clean slate. We'd exchanged Christmas cards and remained on friendly terms, both of us understanding that some chapters in life close completely so that new ones can begin. Dr. Williams had been released after serving 3 years and had lost his medical license permanently. Marcus Thompson was in a halfway house working at a gas station while serving the remainder of his sentence on supervised release. The ripple effects of justice had spread far beyond our immediate situation. Bradley Construction, which had purchased our stolen equipment, had been forced to pay massive fines and had ultimately declared bankruptcy. The owner who'd conspired with Jake was serving 5 years in federal prison. Frank handed me another document that made me smile. The final numbers from our employee profit-sharing program. Every person who worked at Riverside Construction received not just a competitive salary and full benefits, but also a share of the company's annual profits. The previous year, our average employee had received a bonus equal to 4 months of salary money that had paid off CARS-funded children's college educations and helped families achieve financial security. "You know what makes me proudest," Thomas said, looking out at the construction crews preparing for another day of building. "It's not the money or the recognition or even the justice. It's that you've proven that good people can win without becoming like the people who hurt them." The temptation to seek revenge beyond legal justice had been real during the darkest moments of the trial. I could have made my family's lives even more miserable, could have pursued vindictive lawsuits, could have ensured they faced additional hardships beyond their prison sentences. Instead, I'd chosen to focus my energy on building something positive. Every successful project, every employee hired, every family helped by our foundation was a victory that mattered more than any additional punishment for my family. Jennifer arrived at the office around lunchtime, bringing sandwiches and the infectious smile that had drawn me to her from our first meeting. As a social worker, she understood both trauma and recovery in ways that made her the perfect partner for someone rebuilding his life from the ground up. "How are the wedding plans coming along?" Thomas asked, with the grin of someone who'd been lobbying for grandchildren since the day I'd introduced Jennifer as my girlfriend. Jennifer laughed and showed him her engagement ring, a simple, elegant band that represented everything our relationship stood for: honesty, commitment, and genuine love, rather than manipulation or pretense. "Small ceremony next month," she said. "Just family and close friends." The word family no longer brought pain. Frank, Helen, Thomas, Jennifer, and the extended community of people who'd stood by us through everything. This was family in the truest sense of the word. As the afternoon progressed and we prepared for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I reflected on the journey from that Christmas dinner to this moment. The betrayal that had seemed like the end of my world had actually been the beginning of a life more meaningful than anything I could have imagined. Standing before the crowd gathered at the Morrison Family Recreation Center, I spoke about second chances, about the power of community, and about the difference between inherited wealth and earned prosperity. 3 years ago, I concluded, I thought success meant having things handed to you by family. Today I know that real success means building something that makes the world better for the people around you. The applause was warm and genuine, but what mattered more was seeing Helen Morrison wipe away tears of pride as children played in the facility that bore her family name. That evening, as Jennifer and I walked hand in hand through the neighborhood where I'd grown up, I felt a contentment that had nothing to do with money or status. The houses looked the same. The streets followed the same patterns, but everything had changed because I had changed. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your grandfather hadn't faked his death? Jennifer asked. I considered the question seriously. Honestly, I think Jake would have killed both of us eventually. Thomas saved our lives by disappearing when he did. The terrible truth was that my family's greed had been escalating, and without intervention, their crimes would have become even more heinous than what they'd already attempted. As we reached my house, the modest but comfortable home I'd purchased with legitimately earned money, I thought about the question I wanted to ask anyone who might be listening to this story. Jennifer, I said, what would you do if you discovered that people you trusted had been systematically destroying your life while pretending to love you? She stopped walking and turned to face me. I'd hope I'd have the courage to do what you did, fight back with truth instead of sinking to their level. As we went inside and began preparing for another day of building our future together, I realized that my family's betrayal had taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that real strength comes not from what people give you, but from what you build with your own hands and heart. The Christmas dinner that had revealed my family's true nature had also revealed my own capacity for justice, leadership, and love. In trying to destroy me, they'd inadvertently created the person I was always meant to become. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to choose between seeking revenge and building something better? How did you handle betrayal by people you trusted? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find stories about overcoming impossible odds and fighting back against injustice. Subscribe to my channel for more true stories about family drama, workplace conflicts, and the power of never giving up when good people stand together. And if you know someone who's facing their own family crisis or inheritance dispute, please share this story with them. Sometimes knowing that others have survived similar betrayals can provide the hope needed to keep fighting for what's right. Thank you for listening to my story and for believing that justice can prevail when good people refuse to give up. May your own family relationships be built on genuine love and respect, and may you never have to face the kind of betrayal I experienced. Until next time, remember that your worth isn't determined by what others give you. It's determined by what you build with your own integrity and determination.